How do you count textual variants? It may seem like a very simple question, but at least among evangelicals, there have been two different ways in which they've been counted. And I'm going to go through this carefully so you understand the issues. But let me begin by pointing out how we should not count textual variants. And it's not that I want to pick on anybody per se, but I have to use the sources. And as pious and as godly as these folks are, they are not textual scholars, and so they're getting their information from the textual variants from textual critics, and yet they haven't asked the textual critics how to define a variant. So first of all, how not to count variants. Some have estimated, says Norm Geisler in the Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics, that there are about 200,000 textual variants. Now, this book was published in 1998. First of all, these are not errors, but variant readings, the vast majority of which are strictly grammatical. Second, these readings are spread throughout more than 5,300 manuscripts, so that a variant spelling of one letter, of one word in one verse in 2,000 manuscripts is counted as 2,000 errors. So this is what he says in his encyclopedia, published in 1998. Frankly, there's a lot of flat-out errors, not variants, but errors in what he has to say. If the primary goal of New Testament textual criticism is to recover the wording of the autographs or the autographer or the Ausgangstext, as we've said, that is the texts as they left the apostles' hands, then any deviation from that wording is by definition an error. And what we mean is, and this is where Geisler has spent a lot of his academic career writing on inerrancy, and that's fine. But what we're talking about when it comes to textual criticism is not, does this variant reading create a problem for inerrancy, but is this wording down to the very letters what the biblical author himself wrote? And so by that definition, any deviation from that is an error. It's not an error theologically, it's not an error for inerrancy, but it's a deviation from what the author wrote. The goal of textual critics, and textual critics are some of the most, forgive me for my French, but some of the most anal people you'll ever want to meet. Most of them you don't want to meet, but nevertheless, they're so focused on details that they want to get every single letter right. And so there is, if there's an error in terms of, how do you spell the name John? Is it with one end in the middle or two ends? It's the name Ioannis. And every single time we see the name John in the New Testament, it's got two different spellings in the manuscripts. So if the primary goal of textual criticism is to get the wording of the autographs, then any deviation from that wording is by definition an error. Not theologically speaking, but in terms of a deviation from what they wrote. That make sense? Okay. You might even say, well, this is true regardless of what your theological position is. If we hold to verbal plenary inspiration, which Norm Geisler does, he would say that the very words are inspired, and what he would most likely mean by that is right down to the jot and tittle. In other words, it's important for us to try to get back to those very words the way that author wrote them. When we think about errors, it's important for us to think in different categories. We should think in terms of error as along the lines of a theological error where it contradicts the truth of the Bible elsewhere. That would have to do with inerrancy. An error in terms of, as we already mentioned, any difference from what the author himself actually wrote. An error in terms of that's not the exact word that author wrote, and in terms of inspiration, that becomes an issue. But even scholars who have zero bibliology, they don't believe that the Bible is the Word of God. They don't believe it's inspired. They don't believe it's inerrant. They don't believe it's infallible. And they don't believe in verbal plenary inspiration, none of those things. They are concerned to get back to the exact original wording of the New Testament because it's a historical document and we want to know what was said. When we look at, say, the Gettysburg Address, we want to know, did Lincoln say this or did he say that? How did he spell this word? Those may seem to be rather trivial issues, but they are still part of the task. So that was the primary, or the first thing that I think Geisler made a mistake about. The second is the number of manuscripts. 5,300 is way too low. Now, he's not to be faulted for this too much. He wrote this in 1998, but he was using even older sources. Today, the number of Greek New Testament manuscripts that are known to exist is 5,824. And I'm saying this in 2013. That number is actually on its way up because of manuscripts that have been recently discovered and have not yet received an official catalog number. So Geisler was off by more than 500 manuscripts. These are just manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament, by the way, the original language of the New Testament, not any of the ancient versions that it was translated into. So I don't want to follow him too much on that. But then this next point is that he says the estimate of 200,000 textual variants. That is simply way, way too low. In the last 100 years or so, scholars have looked at these textual variants and they said, how many do we actually have? About 100 years ago, the best estimate was about 150,000 textual variants. And then earlier in the 20th century, they came up with a number, maybe mid-20th century, about 200,000 textual variants. That number has increased, though, as we've examined more manuscripts and done some more comparisons. There's been two books especially that have really helped out on this, and there's been some others that have helped us to understand this better. Frankly, we don't have an exact number of how many textual variants there are. But let me just mention a couple of books that have helped us understand this. The first was by Hermann Hoskier, Hoskier, and he wrote a book in 1929, two-volume book called Concerning the Text of the Apocalypse. It took him 30 years of work. What Hoskier did is he went through every single manuscript of the book of Revelation and collated them. That means he wrote down any deviation they have down to the very letters between themselves. And what he then did was he published a text using the Textus Receptus, the Greek text that stands behind the King James Bible, as the text he would print. And then if there's any differences among the manuscripts with that, he'd list each manuscript individually. I dare say that for the book of Revelation alone, if we're going to count manuscripts in terms, or textual variants in terms of how many manuscripts have a variant reading, then I'd say for the book of Revelation alone, we have 200,000, at least. But that's not how we're supposed to count them. So Hoskier shows all these differences, and this is what a collation is you list a text, you have a base text that you're comparing it to, and you only list those differences. And when you list those differences, then you see how much these manuscripts agree with that base text and how much they don't. That was the first book of the New Testament that was ever completely collated, where all the manuscripts were completely examined and compared and written out. And it took the scholar 30 years. Hoskier chose Revelation, most likely, because it was the easiest New Testament book to do, because we have fewer manuscripts for Revelation than for any other book of the New Testament, only about 325. Now, as I said, we've got about 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts. That doesn't mean every one of these manuscripts covers the whole New Testament. In fact, only 60 of them cover the whole New Testament. At the same time, the average Greek New Testament manuscript is more than 450 pages long. So it's a lot of material to go through. My Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts has as one of its fundamental objectives, once we digitize every Greek New Testament manuscript, to feed these through some very sophisticated software that's being developed right now, optical character recognition, or OCR software, so that it'll be able to read these handwritten texts and print out a complete apparatus of all of the textual variants for all of the manuscripts. Our estimate is that if we had all of these manuscripts digitized right now, if one person were to go through and collate all those manuscripts, it would take about 400 years. So unless your name is Methuselah, you don't have a chance of getting it done. With the software that we're developing, it would take about 5 years for one person to do it. It's an enormous change, but what's really driven me is the recognition that this work has to be done, and to date, only 2 New Testament books have been completely collated. The book of Revelation by Hoskier, and then Jude's epistle is the other one that was done by Tommy Wasserman of Lund, Sweden. Wasserman did his doctoral dissertation on the text of Jude. Why did he choose Jude? Probably because it's so short. And if he had chosen 3 John, well, if you choose 3 John, you might as well do 2 John, and then you might as well do 1 John. Jude, the only letter we have written by Jude in the New Testament, so he did that one. It took him 6 years to collate all the manuscripts for Jude. And on the basis of those 2 works, scholars have been able to come up with a better estimate about how many textual variants we have. Still, just an estimate. It's about 400,000 today. That's the numbers that we have. Some estimate as high as 500,000, some go down to 300,000. I'm happiest with just thinking it's about 400,000. But we don't know for sure. And then another mistake that Geisler makes is that he claims that textual variants are counted by the number of manuscripts that support a variant. But the number of manuscripts is almost completely irrelevant. It's not completely irrelevant. There has to be the number of at least 1 manuscript. If you don't have 1 manuscript that disagrees with the others, then by definition, you don't have a variant. They all agree there is no variant. You have to just have 1. But whether you, let me just use this hypothetically, it doesn't matter if you have 1 manuscript that disagrees with some other manuscript or 1,000,000 manuscripts that disagree with another. That counts as 1 textual variant. It's not the number of manuscripts that counts. It's just the changes in wording that counts. So how do we count textual variants? And again, what I'm arguing is this is not a matter of opinion. This is absolute fact, because apologists are taking this information from textual scholars without allowing the textual scholars to define what they mean, even though they take the numbers and they say, oh, here's what they must mean. And yet, frequently, they don't check with the textual critics. A textual variant is counted by the number of wording differences found in the manuscripts, regardless of how many manuscripts have that wording. All that is necessary is that a variant has 1 manuscript with this wording to count. So whether it's 1 manuscript or 2,000 that all have the same variant, it still counts as only 1 variant. So let me just give you a couple of examples. In John chapter 4, verse 1, there's 2 different variants in that passage. The Gospels, by the way, have more manuscripts with them in it than any other portion of the New Testament. As many as 2,000 manuscripts have the Gospels. As I said, Revelation has about 325. I'm talking just about Greek manuscripts now. The next largest section after the Gospels would be Paul's letters. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 800, 850 manuscripts have Paul. And then we have Acts and the Catholic epistles, or the general letters, the ones not written by Roman Catholics, but written by someone besides Paul. And there's about 650 of those. So from 2,000 down to 325, still hundreds of manuscripts for every portion of the New Testament. And some of these manuscripts go all the way back to the 2nd century. John 4:1. Let's say we have just 1,000 manuscripts we'll even split it evenly, 1,000 manuscripts on each side. When Jesus knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, it says. Does it say when Jesus knew, or does it say when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard? It's a textual variant. Some manuscripts have when the Lord knew. Others have when Jesus knew. It really depends what your base text is as to how you're going to count variants. There are going to be some mild differences. But if I start with a base text that says when Jesus knew, which has fewer manuscripts for it, maybe there's 1,000, 1,200 manuscripts that have when the Lord knew, that counts as 1 variant. It doesn't matter if I start with when Jesus knew or with when the Lord knew. It still counts as a single variant. So it doesn't matter how many manuscripts we have. That should be pretty clear. It's important to keep that in mind. Now, an interesting question to raise is, what was the motive for this errant view about errors? I think this method of counting reduces the actual number of differences in wording among the manuscripts to just a few hundred. I should not say I think. This is what this method actually does. If you claim there's 200,000 textual variants, and if you think that there are 5,300 manuscripts that all read at every single place, and let's say you've got just 1,000 manuscripts that disagree, then that means you're going to have 200 places where those 1,000 manuscripts disagree with the other. That comes up to 200,000. That would be really nice if that's how few textual variants we had. The reality is we have a whole lot more than that. And this method gives Christians assurance about having the Word of God in their hands today. But if the assurance has a faulty basis, it is no assurance at all. And this definitely has a faulty basis. Now, we're going to talk about the significance of those 400,000 textual variants later. And the most important issue that we're going to wrestle with is not just the number of variants. In fact, that is largely irrelevant, even though it's a pretty high number. It's the nature of those variants. And we're going to wrestle with how many of them are meaningful and viable. What do they actually affect? Is there any essential belief that Christians have that is dependent on a textual variant? You'd probably like to know whether the resurrection of Jesus is found only in verses that are suspect textually, or is it absolutely secure? That's probably important to know. Most Christians would say, yeah, I think that's kind of a good thing to know, whether I really can believe in the resurrection, can I really believe in the deity of Christ, his virgin birth, salvation by faith, the Trinity, those kinds of things. They're a little bit more than trivial side issues. And so we want to talk about assurance of our faith. We want to talk about the reality of the manuscripts, but we're not going to play games in here, and we're not going to deceive you. We're going to tell you what the reality is, and we need to make some adjustments to that and then think through this. That's why you're taking this course anyway. You want to find out really what's going on and get the full story. Well, what was the source for this evangelical miscalculation? Geisler is not alone in it. Many apologists have made and continue to make the same claims. The source is apparently a book that was published in 1963 called How We Got the Bible. It was by Neil Lightfoot, published by Baker in Grand Rapids. It's been reprinted and edited many times, and it has already sold over 1 million copies, so it's had a huge influence. Neil Lightfoot was no textual critic, though. But here's what he had to say. From one point of view, it may be said that there are 200,000 scribal errors in the manuscripts. Notice this, 200,000 was known in 1963. In 1998, Geisler assumes that's still the number. But it's wholly misleading and untrue to say that there are 200,000 errors in the text of the New Testament. This large number is gained by counting all the variations in all of the manuscripts, about 4,500. This I'll mention a little point about too. This means that if, for example, one word is misspelled in 4,000 different manuscripts, it amounts to 4,000 errors. Actually, in a case of this kind, only one slight error has been made, and it has been copied 4,000 times. But this is the procedure which is followed in arriving at the large number of 200,000 errors. Now, this is just completely wrong. It's not even close to the truth of the reality here. But notice this. He says about 4,500 manuscripts were known in 1963. Geisler says about 5,300 manuscripts. So if you're counting a textual variant by the number of manuscripts that support a reading, then Geisler should have known that in those 25 years between the two documents, between these two books, that we'd have a lot more textual variants than 200,000. But he didn't change those numbers either. But that's again, irrelevant. And for Lightfoot to say, if one word is misspelled in 4,000 different manuscripts, it amounts to 4,000 errors. There's not a single place in the New Testament where we have 4,000 manuscripts that read for that passage. As I said, we have at most about 2,000 manuscripts for the Gospels, and yet not very many of these manuscripts cover all four Gospels without any gaps. Now, the average size New Testament manuscript is over 450 pages long, but most of them do have some gaps in them. And so to have a place where you've got 4,000 manuscripts reading in that place, it doesn't exist. So there's all sorts of things. It's not that I'm just picking on the errors. It's just that as helpful as I'm sure Neil Lightfoot's book has been for hundreds of thousands of Christians, and a very encouraging work, this point that he's making is just wholly fallacious. Now, proof of the miscalculation, just to make sure you get this clearly. The majority text disagrees with the standard critical Greek New Testament, which is known as the Nestle-Aland Novum Testamentum Graeca, in more than 6,500 places. I know because I counted them. In the Hodges-Farstad majority text that was published in 1982, it was 6,577 places. On average, the majority text has a good 500 manuscripts on its side for each variant it supports. I'm saying on average, when you look at the Gospels, Paul, the general letters, and Revelation, in fact, that's probably a little bit low, maybe closer to 800 or so. But that's on average. If Lightfoot is right, then 6,500 textual variants by 500 should not equal more than 200,000. And yet the number is over 3 million. So even looking at just two standard texts, and I'm giving you the basis that Lightfoot says is how we should do this, we actually have more than 3 million variants. And these 6,500 differences are only a small fraction of all the variants that there really are. So what numbers would we actually have? If we count variants the way Lightfoot and Geisler and other apologists have counted it, how many textual variants would we actually have? Rather than this giving comfort to Christians, it's going to cause despair. The Nestle-Aland Novum Testamentum Graeca lists approximately 30,000 textual variants. As I said, not trying to kill a dead horse, but, well, I guess we are. You just want to make sure you get the point. A textual variant is any place where at least one manuscript deviates from a base text. Nestle-Aland lists only a small fraction of all textual variants. But if Lightfoot's method of counting variants were correct, then we would have at least tens of millions of variants. Would that number actually give anyone any assurance at all? Would that comfort you? You know, if you say, well, here's actually how you count a variant, but don't worry about it. There's 150 million textual variants, but don't worry about those. That would, it's time to slit your wrists. You hear that kind of news. Well, no textual critic, to sum up, no textual critic defines a textual variant in the way that Lightfoot has done. And yet the number of textual variants comes from textual critics and their reckoning. Shouldn't they be the ones to define what this means, since they're the ones who are doing the counting? To recap, a textual variant is not a difference in wording times the number of manuscripts supporting the difference. It is simply any place where at least one manuscript differs from a base text. Regardless of how many manuscripts share the same variant, it still only counts as one variant. And as we'll see in the next lecture, there are far more than 200,000 variants, even when properly counted.